The rifle was already cocked when Edwin Sheridan stepped out onto his porch and found her standing on the wrong side of his fence. Not just standing there, either. She had her hands planted on the split-rail post like she owned it, her dark hair unraveling from its pins in the Colorado wind, and she was staring up at the mountain behind his cabin with the kind of hunger in her eyes that he recognized immediately, because he'd once had it himself. Before he'd learned that the mountain always took back what it gave. "Get off my fence," he said. She turned around slowly, and he saw that she wasn't afraid of the rifle. That was the first thing that unsettled him about Inez Thatcher. Most people, when a man came out of a cabin with a Winchester and a look that said he'd used it before and would again, had the reasonable human instinct to step back. She didn't step back. She tilted her head and looked at the rifle the way you'd look at a stray dog that was mostly bark. "Is that loaded?" she asked. "Always." "Then you should probably put it down before you shoot yourself in the foot." He hadn't thought he could be surprised. He'd lived alone on this mountain for 6 years, and in 6 years he'd built himself into something that didn't get surprised. He was 31 years old, had 200 acres of Colorado high country, a herd of 40 horses, and 3 rules that had kept him sane and solitary and safe. 3 rules that had worked perfectly until approximately 17 minutes ago, when a wagon had rattled up his road and deposited this woman at his gate like a problem he hadn't ordered. He lowered the rifle 2 inches, not because she told him to, because he was trying to think. "You're Inez Thatcher," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd received 2 letters from the agency in Denver, and in both of them the name had appeared with the same aggressive clarity that the woman herself now projected. "And you're Edwin Sheridan," she said, "which means we have a situation." "We don't have anything," he said. "You need to get back in that wagon." She turned around to look at where the wagon had been. The wagon was gone. The road was empty, just a pale scar cutting through the ponderosa pine, and the sound of wheels crunching gravel was already fading into the distance somewhere below the tree line. She said. That was when Edwin Sheridan understood that his 3 rules, his carefully constructed fortress of solitude, were about to be tested in ways he had not prepared for. And he understood something else too, something that frightened him considerably more than any threat that mountain had ever thrown at him. He understood, in the irrational, gut-level way that a man sometimes understands things before his mind catches up, that this woman was going to matter to him. That was the most dangerous revelation of all. He did not know yet that before supper, she would break every single rule he had. She would break the first rule within the hour. The second rule would not survive the afternoon. And the third, the one that guarded something he'd buried deep in thought was permanent, would be gone before the sun touched the western peaks. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that the breaking of each rule would feel less like destruction, and more like something long frozen beginning, slowly, painfully, and then all at once to thaw. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why Edwin Sheridan had 3 rules, and why each one cost him something he hadn't known he was still carrying, you have to understand how he came to be on that mountain in the first place. You have to go back to 1878, to a town called Larimer Creek, Colorado, and to a different kind of loss. Edwin Sheridan had not always been a man who lived alone. He had been, for a brief and vivid stretch of his 20s, exactly the opposite. He'd been a man who lived loudly, who worked cattle drives up from New Mexico, who drank whiskey in Pueblo on a Saturday and made it back to work by Monday, who had friends whose names he could still recite like a litany: Thomas Alcott, Jerome Bass, a half-Cherokee cowhand named Calhoun who could read trail sign better than any scout Edwin had ever seen. He'd had all of that, and then the winter of 1876 had come and taken most of it away in a single avalanche that nobody had predicted and nobody could have stopped. He'd been the only one who made it out. Him and 2 horses. And the weight of that had settled on him like a stone that didn't diminish with time. It just became part of him, something he carried so constantly he stopped noticing it until someone brushed against it and the pain flared fresh and hot and terrible. He'd bought the land the following spring. High country, difficult to reach, difficult to farm, difficult for almost any human enterprise. Perfect, he'd thought, for the enterprise of being left alone. The rules came later, after 2 years of working out what solitude actually required if it was going to hold. He'd arrived at 3, and they were specific enough to have teeth. Rule 1. No strangers crossed his fence line without being asked. Rule 2. No one touched his horses without his permission. Rule 3. He did not talk about what was buried on the north slope. Simple rules, clean rules. He had held them for 4 years without incident. And now it was the summer of 1882, and Inez Thatcher was standing on the wrong side of Rule 1 with her traveling trunk sitting in the dirt and nowhere to go. He'd written the letter to the agency 6 months ago, when he'd convinced himself, on a particularly long and miserable January night, that he might be able to tolerate another human presence if it was the right kind. Not a partner, not a friend exactly, more like a household arrangement. A woman who could help manage things, who would not ask too many questions, and who would understand that the land had its own terms and Edwin Sheridan had his. The agency had sent 3 files. He'd chosen Inez Thatcher's because her letter was the shortest. Most of the others had written pages about themselves, their domestic skills, their good Christian temperament, their hopes for a family life. Inez Thatcher had written 11 sentences. She was 26 years old, she was from Santa Fe originally, she was practical and not sentimental, she could cook and keep accounts, and she had no family left to speak of, which meant no one would come looking for her if things did not work out. She had underlined that last part herself, and he had appreciated the forthrightness of it. He had not anticipated her, not the way she stood, not the look she'd given his rifle, not the way she surveyed his land with those dark eyes, moving from the fence to the cabin to the corral to the mountain, methodical and unhurried, like a general assessing terrain. "You can't stay," he said, though even as he said it he was aware that her trunk was on his side of the fence because he'd carried it there without thinking, some old reflex of manners that had survived everything else. "Where would you have me go?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, practical and flat. He looked down the road. "I'll send a rider to Larimer Creek tomorrow. You can wait in the barn." "The barn," she repeated. "It's clean. I'll bring a cot." She looked at the barn, then back at him. "Mr. Sheridan, I have traveled 11 days to get here. I passed through 2 towns where the men looked at me like I was either a criminal or an opportunity, and one of those towns had a cholera outbreak that the stagecoach driver failed to mention until we were already through it. I am not a sentimental woman, as I believe I mentioned in my correspondence, but I will not sleep in a barn. Then you'll sleep on the porch." "I'll sleep in the house," she said. There was a silence that stretched long and taut between them. "There is 1 bedroom," Edwin said. "Then you'll sleep on the porch," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. He was aware that this was not how he had imagined this conversation going when he'd written that letter 6 months ago. He was also aware that she was right, strictly speaking, about the barn. He had a code about things like that. His mother had given it to him before she died, a set of obligations that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with basic human decency, and he could not in good conscience put a woman who had traveled 11 days in a barn. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "But you need to understand something." She waited. That was another thing that unsettled him. She didn't fill silences, she let them be. "This is my land," he said. "I have rules, you follow them and we'll be fine." "What rules?" she asked. He told her. He told her all 3 plainly and without explanation, the way you posted signs on fences. No one crosses without being asked. No one touches the horses without permission. No one goes to the north slope. She listened to each one. Her face did not change. "All right," she said when he finished, and he believed her. That was his second mistake, the first having been writing the letter at all. He carried her trunk to the bedroom, which took up roughly a third of the cabin's square footage. The rest was one large room with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and the shelves of supplies he ordered from Larimer Creek every 2 months. The cabin was not beautiful, but it was solid. He had built it himself over the course of a summer, and it had stood through 4 hard winters without complaint, which was more than he could say for most things. She set her bag on the bed and looked around the bedroom. There was a window that faced east, a washstand, a hook on the back of the door for clothes. "Thank you," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. He went back outside because the cabin was feeling suddenly smaller than it had that morning. The first rule broke quietly and without drama, which somehow made it worse. He had gone to the corral to check on a mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg, a roan he'd acquired the previous spring named Cedar. He was crouched down examining the leg, running his fingers along the tendon, when he heard footsteps on the dry grass behind him. He turned and found Inez Thatcher standing at the fence of the corral. She was not inside the corral. She was on the outside of it, which was technically still on his land, which was technically a violation of Rule 1, but he had already brought her inside the fence line by installing her in his bedroom, so that ship had sailed. He was thinking about saying something when he saw what she was looking at. Cedar was watching Inez with both ears forward. The roan was not a friendly horse. She'd been rough-handled before Edwin had gotten her, and she had a mistrust of people that was profound and fully justified, and she did not approach strangers. She was approaching Inez, not quickly. Slowly, cautiously, the way she moved when she was uncertain but curious, her nose stretched out, her breath making small steam puffs in the cool mountain air. "Don't touch her," Edwin said, standing up. Inez's hand was already raised, palm up, the way you offered yourself to a nervous animal. She didn't pull it back. She held perfectly still and let the roan come to her, and Cedar walked the last few feet and pressed her nose into Inez's palm with a low, soft sound. "She's been hurt," Inez said quietly. "She said it the way you state a fact, not an accusation." "Yes," Edwin said, "by a person." "Yes." Inez kept her hand still while Cedar breathed against it. Her eyes were soft in a way they hadn't been before, a way he hadn't expected from someone who'd introduced herself by informing him his rifle was a foot hazard. "My father had horses," she said. "In Santa Fe, good ones. He trained them the right way." She paused. "He died when I was 22. The horses were sold to pay the debts." He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what the right thing to say was, and he'd learned that silence was almost always better than the wrong thing. Cedar was nudging Inez's palm now, looking for the apple or piece of bread that was clearly not there. Inez laughed, just briefly, just a small sound, but it went through the afternoon air like something thrown. "Rule 1 is already in trouble," she said, not looking at him. "I moved the fence line in my head," he said. She glanced at him then, surprised, and he saw it, the quick flash of a real smile before she pulled it back into composure. It was only a second, but he filed it somewhere without meaning to. "I'll bring her an apple tomorrow," Inez said, "with your permission." He considered refusing. The refusal was right there, available and logical. Instead, he heard himself say, "She likes the ones from the tree by the east wall." Inez nodded, as if that was entirely reasonable. She stepped back from the fence and looked up at the cabin, then at the sky, making calculations he wasn't privy to. "I'll start supper," she said. "What do you have?" "Flour, salt pork, dried beans, some canned tomatoes. There's a root cellar with carrots and 2 onions. Dried apple rings in the tin on the second shelf." She took inventory of this the way she'd taken inventory of his land. "I can work with that," she said, and went inside. He stood at the corral fence a while longer. Cedar had gone back to her water trough, satisfied. The mountain cast its long, late afternoon shadow across the grass, and the shadow was getting longer every minute, the sun tilting west toward the line of peaks where the sky went orange, and then, slowly, impossibly, the color of old blood. He had a feeling he couldn't name, the way you feel when a storm is coming and you can't see it yet, but the pressure in the air has changed. Something was different. Not bad necessarily, just different. And different on this mountain had always been something to watch very carefully. He went to split wood. He didn't need the wood, the pile was already adequate, but he needed the rhythm of the axe, the clean mechanical satisfaction of it while he thought. She had touched cedar. He had not stopped her. Rule 2 had not even waited until supper. He was still splitting wood when the smell of something good came out of the cabin. He paused with the axe, not meaning to, and realized it was the smell of onions cooking in salt pork fat, and it was doing something to him that he hadn't expected, reaching into something old and warm and almost painful in the way that good things can be painful when you haven't had them in a long time. He split 4 more logs and then put the axe down. Inside, the wood stove was lit, the room was warm, and Inez Thatcher was standing at the stove with his single cast iron skillet, stirring something that smelled considerably better than anything he had made in the past 6 years. She'd found an apron, which must have been in her trunk, because he certainly didn't own one. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back more efficiently than it had been when she arrived, and she moved around his kitchen, his very specific, carefully arranged kitchen, with a confidence that should have bothered him. It did not bother him. He sat down at the table without being told, which was another thing he noticed about her. She didn't tell you where to sit or when to sit. She simply created a situation in which sitting felt like the obvious thing to do. "There's no coffee," he said. "I know, I found the tin. It was empty." She didn't look up from the skillet. "Do you have a garden?" "Not much of one. Some beans were coming in last time I checked." "You should have a garden. This country grows things if you let it. The season is short." "Most things worth growing have short seasons," she said, and he couldn't tell if she meant it as plain farming sense or something else, so he left it alone. She put a plate in front of him. Salt pork, beans cooked down with the tomatoes, an onion, the carrots cut and fried alongside. It was simple, exactly the ingredients he'd listed, but it was something entirely other than what he usually produced from those same ingredients. He ate it and did not say anything because he was not sure how to say what he wanted to say, which was that it tasted like something his mother had made, and he had not thought about that in a very long time. Inez sat down across from him with her own plate and ate without looking at him. The fire in the wood stove clicked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in that particular way it did in the late evening, a low, continuous sound, not threatening, just present. "Tell me about the North Slope," she said. Every muscle in his back went rigid. He set his fork down. She looked up then, and she was watching him with that clear, direct gaze that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things. She wasn't being cruel. She wasn't trying to find a weak place to press. She was asking the way she asked everything, straight on, no apology. "That's the 3rd rule," he said. "I know it is." She picked up her fork again. "I'm not going to the North Slope. I'm asking you to tell me about it. The rule is that no one goes to it and no one talks about it." "Rules often exist because someone decided not to talk about something," she said. "That's usually when they become necessary." He stared at her. "Have you always been this direct?" "No," she said without any irony. "I spent several years being indirect. It didn't serve anyone." He picked up his fork again. "I'm not talking about the North Slope." "All right," she said. They finished supper in silence that was not, strangely, uncomfortable. He cleared the plates. She found a cloth and wiped down the table with a brisk efficiency that made the table look better than it had in months. "I'll need to know which days you want me to handle what," she said. "And what you handle yourself. I don't want to step into something you have your own way of doing." "Everything has its own way," he said. "Then tell me." So he told her. He told her the water came from the creek to the east, and he hauled it every other day. He told her the root cellar needed checking every week, because the temperature swings were dramatic at this altitude, and things spoiled faster than you expected. He told her the horses were his responsibility, and she was not to feel obligated toward them, though she was welcome to spend time with Cedar if Cedar permitted it. He told her the supply order went to Larimer Creek the 1st of every month. He told her the wood stove had a temperamental left damper. She listened to all of it and asked 3 questions, good ones, practical ones, that told him she'd been managing a household for a long time and understood its rhythms. He found to his slight bewilderment that he was giving her more information than she'd asked for, filling in details, explaining the logic of things he'd never had to explain to anyone. "You built this place alone?" she asked at the end. "Yes." "In how long?" "1 summer, with a winter to finish the interior." She looked around the cabin with a different expression than the inventory one, something softer. "That's remarkable," she said, "not flattery, just observation. It needed to exist," he said, "so I built it." She nodded slowly, as if that answered something she'd been wondering about him since she arrived. Then she said good night and went to the bedroom and closed the door, and Edwin Sheridan sat alone by the wood stove in the dark that wasn't quite dark yet, thinking about things he hadn't thought about in a very long time. He thought about his mother, who had made beans taste like something. He thought about Thomas Alcott, who had been sitting 3 feet from him when the mountain came down. He thought about what was on the north slope, under the wooden marker he'd put there himself, and what it would feel like to have someone sit across a table from him while he talked about it. He didn't sleep well, but that was nothing new. The second morning was where things started to shift in ways he could track. He woke before dawn, as always, dressed in the dark, and went out to check the horses. Cedar was in the corner of the corral looking at the cabin with an attention that was unusual for her. He fed the herd, checked the water, and was coming back around the east side of the barn when he found Inez Thatcher at the apple tree. She was in her plain gray dress with a shawl over her shoulders and her hair still loose, reaching up into the tree, which dropped its small tart apples in abundance at this time of summer. She had 3 in her apron and was reaching for a 4th. It was barely light. The sky was pearl gray and the mountain was a dark shape against it, and the air was cold enough that both of them were breathing visible clouds. "You're up early," he said. "I always am," she said, and came down from her tiptoes with the 4th apple. "I promised Cedar." He watched her cross to the corral, the 4 apples in her apron, and he watched Cedar come to the fence immediately, ears forward, no hesitation. And he understood that something had shifted in that horse overnight. Some decision had been made, and he trusted Cedar's decisions about people more than he trusted his own. He went inside and started the fire in the wood stove and put water on to heat, and did not think too hard about what that meant. Over the following days they found a rhythm, which surprised him. He'd expected friction. He'd expected the sharp grinding of 2 people who had developed their ways in isolation. There was some of that, certainly. She rearranged his shelves on the 3rd day in a way that made more sense but required him to relearn where everything was. He woke up on the 4th morning to find she'd reorganized the root cellar, rotating the stores so the oldest things were at the front. And while this was entirely correct and practical, it was also, he reflected, very much done in his root cellar without his being asked. He went to the cabin and stood in the doorway and said, "You reorganized the root cellar." She looked up from the account ledger she'd found and was correcting because his figures apparently did not add up on 2 pages. "I did," she said. "The turnips were going soft at the back. You'd have lost them by winter. You could have told me first. You were out with the horses." She set down his ledger. "I should have waited." "You're right." He hadn't expected the admission. He'd been prepared to argue. "The shelf arrangement," he said. "Yes, I should have asked about that too." She was looking at him directly, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. "I have a habit of seeing something that needs doing and doing it. My mother called it helpful. My previous employer called it presumptuous." "You had an employer." "I kept accounts for a trading company in Santa Fe for 4 years after my father died." She picked up the ledger again. "You have an arithmetic error on page 17, $40 and some cents if you want me to find it." He sat down across from her, which by now was simply what he did at that table. "Find it," he said. She found it. She explained it in 3 clear sentences. Then she showed him 2 other places where the bookkeeping could be simplified, not errors exactly but inefficiencies, and she did it the way she did most things, matter-of-factly, without making him feel diminished by it. He was good with horses and land and weather and wood and 100 physical things, but he'd always known his head for figures was only adequate, and hearing someone explain a better system for the ledger without any particular drama felt, strangely, like relief. "You managed accounts for a trading company," he said. "Why are you here?" She didn't answer right away. She set the ledger down and smoothed the open page with her thumb, a small habitual gesture. "The trading company was owned by two brothers," she said. "The older one retired and the younger one had different ideas about what a woman in the office was for. He understood immediately what she was saying and what she wasn't saying, and something in him went cold and precise in the way it did when he was angry. "You left," he said. "I left," she said. "And there weren't many options. I'm a practical woman, Mr. Sheridan. Your agency offered practical options." He thought about the letter he'd written and what it must have looked like to her. Another man on a remote piece of land offering a woman a position with unclear terms in an isolated location. He thought about what it must have taken for her to get on that stagecoach anyway. "My terms are clear," he said. "I should have been more explicit in the letter. You run the household accounts, help with the supplies, manage the kitchen and the root cellar and whatever else you choose to take on. There's a monthly wage, same as I wrote. The rest of the land and the horses are mine. Your time after your work is your own." She looked at him for a long moment. "And the fence line?" she asked. He realized he was sitting at a table with her, inside the fence line, had been sitting at that table for 4 days. He also realized that Rule 1, the way he'd stated it, was not really what he'd meant when he'd made it. What he'd meant was that no one came onto his land unasked, because on this mountain, unasked arrivals had tended toward catastrophe. What he'd meant was that he didn't want to be surprised again, the way the winter of 1876 had surprised him. Inez Thatcher had been asked, technically. He had written a letter. The letter had not been explicit about the terms, but the invitation had existed, and she had come, and she had not been catastrophe. "Not yet," said the cautious part of him, but he was tired of listening to that part. "The fence line," he said, "is managed by common sense, and you seem to have more than enough of that." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more considered than a smile. "Thank you," she said, and she went back to the ledger. That evening, without planning to, he told her about Thomas Alcott, not all of it. Just the part where Thomas had been the one who first told Edwin about high country, about what you could build there if you were willing to do the hard thing of being cold and isolated and working harder than you'd ever worked in your life. Thomas had talked about it the way some men talked about gold, with a kind of irrational conviction that was infectious, and Edwin had caught it from him and carried it through 2 years of cattle drives before he finally saw the high country himself and understood that Thomas hadn't been exaggerating. He hadn't been talking about getting rich. He'd been talking about something closer to salvation. Inez listened. She sat with her hands around the tin mug of hot water with a dried apple slice in it, which was her evening ritual now, and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "He sounds like someone who saw things clearly." "He did," Edwin said. "Are you going to tell me the rest of it?" she asked, not pushy, just open. "Not tonight," he said. "All right," she said, and she didn't push. And something in him that had been held very tight for 6 years loosened just incrementally, just enough to notice. On the 5th day she asked to ride one of the horses. He'd gone out to find her at the corral again, which was where she spent an hour every morning now, talking to Cedar mostly. And Cedar had in those 5 days gone from cautiously curious to openly devoted in the way horses will when they decide someone is safe. The roan would put her head over the fence rail and press her nose into Inez's hair, which Inez submitted to with a patience that Edwin found inexplicably moving. "I'd like to ride," Inez said without preamble. "Not Cedar, she's not ready for that, but there's a bay gelding at the far end who's been watching me." Edwin looked. The bay, whose name was Prospect, was indeed watching Inez with the bright, intelligent attention he brought to most things he found interesting. "You know horses," Edwin said. I grew up with them." She turned to look at him. "I'll ask rather than just doing it, so I'm asking." He brought out Prospect's saddle and helped her check the fit, and he watched her mount with the ease of someone who'd been on horseback since childhood, the way she settled her weight, the way her hands held the reins with authority but not tension. He opened the gate, and she rode out into the grass, and he stood at the fence and watched her go. She was good. Better than good, she was natural, the way some people are natural on horses, her body moving with the animal rather than against it, her head up and her back straight, and Prospect stepping out with an enthusiasm he didn't usually show for casual riding. She went across the south meadow and up the long slope toward the tree line, and then turned and came back at a canter, her hair coming loose from its pins again in the wind. And something in Edwin Sheridan's chest did something complicated and alarming that he had not given it permission to do. She pulled up at the gate, and her face was flushed from the wind, and there was an expression there he hadn't seen before, wide open and glad, without any of the careful practical composure she carried like a uniform. "He's wonderful," she said, a little breathless. "He is," Edwin agreed, and he was not entirely talking about the horse. She caught something in his voice and looked at him, and for a moment something passed between them that neither of them named. Then she looked away, back at Prospect, running her hand down the gelding's neck, and the moment was gone, but it left a mark. "Thank you," she said in the careful voice, and he took Prospect's bridle and walked them both back to the corral. That afternoon he went to the north slope. He did not intend to bring her. He went alone, as he always did, up the trail that left the main path a quarter-mile from the cabin and climbed steeply through the spruce until it reached the small clearing where the ground was still slightly different than the ground around it, where a wooden marker stood that he'd carved himself in the winter of 1876, sitting in this very spot with frozen hands and a grief so comprehensive it had been almost abstract. 3 names on the marker: Thomas Alcott, Jerome Bass, Calhoun, with no second name because no one had known it. He stood there in the afternoon quiet, which was its own particular quality of quiet, the kind you only got above 8,000 feet, and he thought about what Inez had said. Rules often exist because someone decided not to talk about something. He had decided not to talk about this. He had decided the North Slope was his alone to grieve, that bringing anyone here would be a violation of something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. The men who were buried here had been his responsibility, at least in the way he'd always felt it, though the avalanche had been no one's fault. It had been a mountain doing what mountains do, indifferent and catastrophic. But the guilt had never cared about logic, and he'd carried it here to the high country and built a cabin in its shadow, and the 3 rules had been, more than anything, a way of maintaining the belief that he could prevent another thing he loved from being lost. Don't let anyone in. Don't give anything to be taken. Don't talk about the dead. He stood at the marker until the shadows shifted, and then he went back down. Inez was at the table when he came in. She had the ledger and a piece of paper, and she was writing something. A list of supplies he saw when he got closer. She looked up when he came in, and she looked at him the way she looked at Cedar, seeing something she didn't speak to directly. "I went to the North Slope," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw you go up the back trail." He sat down. He didn't say anything for a while, and she let him not say anything. "There's a marker up there," he said finally, "for 3 men who died in an avalanche in 1876. I was the only one who got out." Silence. Not awkward, just present. "They worked with you," she said. "They were my friends," he said. It was the first time he'd said that out loud in 6 years, and it surprised him, the physical reality of it in his mouth. Thomas Alcott, Jerome Bass, and Calhoun. Calhoun was half Cherokee, best trail reader I ever knew. Thomas was the one who told me about high country. He stopped. We were moving a small remuda between 2 ranches in the San Juan Range. February. We knew the conditions were questionable. Thomas said we should wait. I said we'd be fine. He looked at the table. I was the senior man. "Edwin," she said. He looked up. She had never used his first name before. It came out of her quietly, not soft exactly, just full. "You were wrong about the weather," she said. "You were not wrong about them. There's a difference." He didn't know why that particular distinction, which he'd told himself 100 times in 100 variations, landed differently coming from her. Perhaps because she said it the same way she said everything, without trying to make it land, without performing comfort, just stating what she believed to be true and letting him do what he wanted with it. "The third rule," he said. "That's what it's for. If no one talks about it, it stays contained. It stays up there where I put it." "But it doesn't, does it?" she said, not a question. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She was quiet again. Then she set down her pencil and folded her hands on the table. "My mother died of fever when I was 16, she said. "My father did his best, but he was a man who understood horses better than people, including his own daughter. When he died, the debts from the business took everything. I took the position at the trading company because I had no other option, and because I was good at it, and I stayed 2 years longer than I should have because leaving felt like admitting another failure. And then I left anyway and answered your letter because the alternative was to stay in Santa Fe and try to find a different employer, and I was tired." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because you told me something true, and it seemed like the right response to tell you something true in return." He looked at her for a long time. He was trying to understand what she was to him, this woman who had appeared at his fence and broken his rules and fed him dinner and talked to his damaged horse and read his ledger, and now sat across the table from him in the quiet of the mountain evening, completely herself, not trying to be anything other than exactly what she was. "The rules are gone," he said. "They were already going," she said. "The fence, the horses, the north slope, you broke them yourself, every one." "You broke the fence one," he said. "You were standing there. You wrote the letter," she said. "That was the invitation. The fence was already open." He thought about that. "You didn't touch cedar without asking." "Eventually," she said. "The first morning I thought about it." He almost smiled, which was something his face did so rarely these days it felt like a different muscle entirely. "You're very honest," he said. "I've been dishonest," she said. "It costs more than honesty does." He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the evening, at the way the mountain went dark against a sky still faintly lit at the horizon. "I don't want to be alone here anymore," he said. It was not a declaration. It was barely above a statement of fact, but it was the most exposed thing he'd said in years. He heard her chair, and then she was standing beside him, not touching him, just standing at the same window. "I don't think I want to leave," she said. He turned to look at her profile, the straight line of her nose, the set of her jaw, the careful composure that he now understood was not coldness but discipline, the practiced control of someone who had learned that needing things was dangerous. "Then stay," he said. She turned to look at him then, and there it was again, that expression he'd seen when she'd come back from riding, the wide-open one, unguarded, briefly luminous. "I'm not a housekeeper," she said. "I mean, I am. I've been managing your accounts for a week, and I reorganized your root cellar, and I intend to start a proper garden before the season ends. But I am not only that." "I know," he said. "And you're not only a man who lives on a mountain with his horses and his rules and his grief." "I know that too," he said. "I'd just forgotten." She was quiet for a moment, and the evening came in through the window, and the pine smell came with it, and somewhere below the corral cedar made a soft sound that carried up in the still air. "You should know," Inez said carefully, "that I am not easy to live with. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I will not stop having them." "You rearranged my shelves," he said. "The rearrangement was logical." "I know it was. I liked it." She looked at him with slight suspicion, as if this admission might be a trap. "You're sure?" "I have been looking for the flower in the wrong place for a week out of pure stubbornness," he said. "I knew it was better where you put it." She laughed. A real one this time, not the small surprised sound from the corral, but a full, genuine laugh. And it went through the cabin the way the wind went through the pines, that low continuous sound, and he felt it do something to the stone in his chest, the one that had been there so long he'd stopped feeling it as separate from himself. "I'm going to take that as progress," she said. "It is," he agreed. They stood at the window together a while longer, and there was something between them now that had no name yet but was unmistakably there. Present the way things are present when they have been building slowly over days, and then suddenly become visible. He reached out and took her hand, which was lying at her side, and she let him. And her hand was warm and practical, and the knuckles were slightly rough from work. And he held it the way you hold something that matters, not tightly, just deliberately. "I'm going to be very bad at this," he said. "So am I," she said. "We'll manage." The weeks that followed were a kind of education that Edwin Sheridan had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. He had thought he understood solitude, had thought he knew its contours and requirements, had thought he had arranged his life in such a way that the absence of another person was not a deprivation but a structure. He discovered, with the mixed sensation of someone learning they've been reading a map upside down, that he had been wrong. Inez started her garden on the south-facing slope below the cabin, which got the most sun, and was protected from the worst of the afternoon wind by the cabin's bulk. She grew it from seeds she'd carried in a small tin in her trunk, seeds she'd collected in Santa Fe from plants her father had grown, and from packets she'd purchased in Denver on her way through. By late summer, in that short, fierce growing season, she had green beans and carrots and one magnificent squash, and a patch of herbs that made the cabin smell, on warm evenings when the door was open, like something rich and complicated. He watched her work in the garden the way he watched horses move in the field, with a kind of absorbed attention that he recognized, uncomfortably, as something more than appreciation for competence. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her hat low, and she sang sometimes, not self-consciously, not performing for anyone, just quietly and to herself, Mexican songs her mother had taught her, and the sound of them drifted up through the open window of the cabin when he was inside doing something else. He asked her about her mother's people one evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the mountain go dark. "My grandfather on my mother's side was from Chihuahua," she said. "He brought his family north before the war. My grandmother spoke Spanish and some Nahuatl and eventually learned English, and they all blended in her kitchen in ways that weren't always orthodox but were almost always delicious." She smiled. "My mother learned to cook from her and taught me. My father called it the best thing about either side of the family. He was Anglo, third-generation Virginian," she said. "As out of place in New Mexico as a man could be, but he loved it there. He said the light was different." He was right. "The light here is different too," Edwin said. "Different from Santa Fe," she agreed. "More vertical, everything is closer to the sky." She looked up at the stars, which at this altitude were so bright and numerous they looked improbable, like someone had been too generous. "I didn't know if I could live somewhere cold," she said. "I've never been cold the way this mountain is cold." "It gets worse," he said. "October it starts in earnest. December and January you don't go far from the cabin. Then we'll need more supplies than you usually order," she said, "and better insulation on the north wall. I noticed it this morning. There's a draft below the second window. I know about the draft. Did you mean to fix it?" "Eventually. Eventually will be December at 30 below," she said. "I'd rather do it in September." "I'll fix the wall in September," he said. "I can help," she said. "I know you can," he said, and she looked at him, and the stars were very bright, and his hand found hers in the dark between their chairs. They had not discussed what they were to each other. They had not needed to. Something had been established that night at the window, had been building since the day she'd arrived at his fence, and it continued to build in the days after with the patient inevitability of weather, of seasons, of things that happen because the conditions are right, and no amount of caution or rule-keeping can prevent what is meant to occur. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late August, which he knew was a Thursday because it was the day he usually checked the supply schedule. And he had been sitting at the table doing exactly that when she came in from the garden with a handful of green beans and a streak of dirt on her jaw, and he looked up, and the decision made itself before he'd consciously arrived at it. He stood up from the table and she stopped walking when she saw him stand, and her eyes went wide, and he crossed the room and touched the dirt on her jaw with his thumb and said, "You've got dirt on your face." And she said, "I know, I was going to wash." And then he kissed her before she could do anything as sensible as washing. She made a small surprised sound, and then she kissed him back, and the green beans made it to the table somehow, and the supply schedule remained unfinished until Friday. He told her he loved her in October when the first snow came. It wasn't planned. He'd never been a man who planned declarations. He'd been out checking the fence line on the north pasture when the snow came in fast off the peaks, the way the first snow of autumn always did, sudden and purposeful. And by the time he got back to the cabin, his hat was white, and his hands were cold, and the whole mountain had gone silver and still. He pushed open the cabin door, and she was at the stove, the fire well banked, the soup already on, and she turned around when he came in, and the look on her face when she saw him, something relieved and glad, something that had been waiting for the sound of his boots on the step, lit him up from somewhere inside. "The north fence held," he said, pulling off his coat. "Snow's going to be early this year." "I know," she said. "I put extra blankets out this morning." She came and took his hat, shaking the snow from it. "Your hands are frozen." "They're fine," he said, which was not entirely true, and she took his hands and held them between hers, which were warm from the stove. "Edwin," she said, looking down at his hands. "Inez," he said. She looked up, and he said it, simply, the way he'd said most true things recently, without decoration or strategy. "I love you." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire clicked. The snow pressed its white weight against the windows. He could feel her hands, warm around his cold ones, and the careful composure was entirely gone, and she looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who didn't know what to say next. "I love you too," she said finally, and her voice was so quiet he felt it more than heard it. He pulled her closer, and she came, her forehead against his jaw, and they stood like that in the warm cabin while the mountain's first snow built up on the windowsills and the ponderosa pines and the fence rails and the marker on the north slope, covering it gently, the way time covers grief, not erasing it but giving it a different texture, softer, less sharp. "I want to marry you," he said. She pulled back far enough to look at his face. "I expected you to think about it longer," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the day you arrived," he said. "You pointed a rifle at me," she said. "I was thinking about it while I was pointing the rifle," he said, and that surprised a laugh out of her, and the laugh went through the cabin, and he pulled her back in and kissed her temple, and outside the snow came down and the mountain went white and quiet. They were married in November in Larimer Creek, at the small Methodist church on the main street, which had a minister who had clearly officiated a very large number of frontier weddings and maintained a brisk but not unkind pace. Inez wore her best dress, a deep burgundy wool that she'd been keeping in the bottom of her trunk since Santa Fe, and Edwin wore the good coat he'd bought in Denver 4 years ago and had worn precisely twice since. The witnesses were the shopkeeper from the general store and his wife, a woman named Clara Hodges who had been born in Ohio and made it to Colorado by way of 6 years of hard living, and was therefore not sentimental about anything except kindness, of which she showed a great deal. After the ceremony, Clara Hodges pulled Inez aside while Edwin was shaking the minister's hand and said, in a low voice, "He hasn't been in town for anything but supplies in 4 years. I hope you know what you've done for him." "I think he's done considerable things for me," Inez said. "That's how you know it's the right kind," Clara said and kissed her on the cheek. They stayed one night in Larimer Creek at the hotel on the 2nd Street, which had clean sheets and a decent stove and was the most comfortable night's sleep Edwin Sheridan had had in years, which he admitted to Inez the next morning over breakfast. "More comfortable than your own cabin?" she asked, amused. "Your company improves any room substantially," he said. She looked at him over her coffee, and there was that expression, the wide-open, unguarded one. He'd learned since August that it appeared most often when he said something true, and he had developed, without intending to, the habit of trying to produce it. "We should get back," she said. "Cedar frets when I'm gone too long." "Cedar is a horse," he said. Cedar is a horse with feelings, Inez said firmly, and he didn't argue because she was right, and because arguing with Inez Thatcher about something she was right about was a pastime that yielded very little return. The winter was hard, as he'd warned her it would be. December brought temperatures that made going to the corral an exercise in serious preparation, and the mountain closed itself off in the way it did, becoming a thing apart, a white world with rules different from the ones that applied in the valleys below. But the cabin held, the north wall insulated properly in September, which Inez had been right about in September, and which he admitted she was right about in December when the temperature dropped to places that made the second winter's draft irrelevant. The fire held, the supplies held. Cedar and the rest of the horses were healthy, and Prospect had apparently decided that Inez was his rider now and no one else's, which Edwin had complicated feelings about and which Inez was entirely smug about. They spent those long winter evenings with the fire high and the wind pushing at the walls and the darkness coming down by 5 in the afternoon, reading sometimes, talking sometimes, sitting in companionable quiet sometimes in the way that people sit when they are entirely comfortable with each other and do not require noise to fill the space between them. He told her about Thomas Alcott in full, in January. Not just the pieces he'd offered before, but all of it, the drives, the Saturday whiskey, the way Thomas would talk about the high country at night around a fire with the kind of faith that you usually only heard from preachers. He told her about Jerome Bass, who had been 23 and married 6 months, whose wife had come to Edwin after the avalanche and looked at him with eyes that contained everything she hadn't said and never would say. He told her about Calhoun, who had been 35 and had known the mountains better than any of them, and had still not been able to predict what happened that February, because some things cannot be predicted. He told her about coming out of the snow and knowing he was the only one, the particular silence of that knowledge, the way the world had felt both completely ordinary and completely different at the same time. She listened to all of it. She held his hand through most of it. She did not tell him it wasn't his fault, because she'd already told him that once and she understood that saying it again would not help. Instead, she said, what were they like, the 3 of them, when things were good? And he told her that too. He told her the funny stories, the ones he hadn't told anyone, the ones that had been locked up in him along with the grief because they'd been too entangled to separate. He told her about Thomas losing his hat to a gust outside Albuquerque and chasing it across a mesa for 40 minutes while Jerome timed him. He told her about Calhoun's absolute, unshakable conviction that a certain variety of Colorado grasshopper predicted rainfall with more accuracy than any barometer, and about the running argument about this that had lasted 3 summers. He laughed twice while he was telling her, genuine laughter surprised out of him, and she laughed with him, and afterward there was a quietness that was not grief but something adjacent to it, something softer, something that had been cleaned. You should go up there in the spring, she said. When it's good on the mountain. I go every year, he said. I'll come with you, she said. If you want. He thought about it. He thought about what the marker looked like in spring when the snow melted back and the first alpine flowers came up around it, small and fierce and purple, and whether he wanted to share that with anyone. He had always thought the answer was no. He found, sitting in the firelight with her hand in his, that it had changed. I'd like that, he said. Spring came slow and bright and complicated, the way Colorado springs always did, with false starts and late storms, and then suddenly everything green and urgent. The mountain shed its snow in stages, the lower slopes first, then gradually, week by week, the snowline retreating toward the peaks until by May the south meadow was green and the creek was running fast and loud, and the horses were in the pasture all day. He took her to the north slope on a clear morning in late May, when the alpine flowers were up around the marker. They went together up the back trail, the same one she'd seen him take in the fall, and the mountain was quiet around them in the particular way it was quiet in the morning, before the wind started. She read the marker, The 3 names he'd carved in the cold of that first terrible winter. She stood there for a while without saying anything. Then she looked at him, and there was something in her face that was simply grief, not for her grief but for his, and the precise honesty of it, her willingness to feel what the moment asked rather than manage it, was something he was still learning about her and was still being moved by. She reached out and took his hand. They stood there for a while. The flowers moved in a small wind. Below them the cabin was a brown square in the green, and the corral was visible with the horses moving in it, and the smoke from the morning fire was still trailing from the chimney. "They would have liked it here," he said. "I think so too," she said. "Thomas especially." "You never met Thomas." "No," she said, "but I know what he saw in you, and I know what kind of man goes looking for what he described." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "He was right about the high country." "Yes," Edwin said. "He was." They went back down, and the day opened up around them, warm and full of work and all the ordinary things that a working piece of mountain land required. He checked the fence line. She started the garden again, expanding it this year with the confidence of someone who knew what the ground would hold. The horses were fine. Cedar was magnificent. Prospect was incorrigibly devoted to Inez and would sulk visibly if she skipped a morning visit, which was mortifying for a bay gelding of his standing. She told him, on a warm evening in June, that she was expecting a baby. She told him the way she told him everything, directly and without ceremony, sitting across the table from him with her hands folded. He looked at her for a long moment, processing it the way you process something you've hoped for without admitting you were hoping for it. "When?" he asked. "January, I think," she said. "I'm not certain of the exact date." He reached across the table and took her hands. He did not say anything for a moment because he was feeling too many things at once, all of them overlapping joy and terror and a fierce, almost overwhelming tenderness that had no precedent in his experience. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm strong and I'm healthy, and women have been doing this since the beginning of time." She paused. "I would like to have the doctor from Larimer Creek here closer to the time." "I'll bring him," Edwin said. "He can stay in the barn." "He can stay in the house," she said. "You can sleep in the barn," he laughed. The sound of it surprised him, the way his laughing still sometimes surprised him, like a muscle you'd stopped using and had to relearn. "Inez," he said. "Edwin," she said, with that same quiet fullness she'd used when she first said his name. "We're going to be good at this," he said. He wasn't sure where the certainty came from. He'd been uncertain about most things for most of his adult life. But he was certain about this. She turned his hands over in hers and looked at them, the work-roughened knuckles, the calluses from the axe handle and the rope in the fence wire, and she said, "I think we are." The months of the pregnancy moved with a quality of time he hadn't experienced before, both slow and swift, days that were individual and distinct, and a progression that was relentless. The garden was spectacular that summer, the best it had ever been, and Inez worked in it with modifications for her changing body that were all her own design. A low stool, a longer-handled hoe, arrangements that maintained the work while acknowledging the new terms. He worried. He would not have said he was a worrying man, but he found that he watched the weather differently now, tracked the road conditions to Larimer Creek with a precision he hadn't previously thought necessary, inventoried the medical supplies with a thoroughness that the previous Edwin Sheridan would have found excessive. He repaired everything that needed repairing and several things that didn't, drove 3 new fence posts and replaced a window on the east side and fixed the wood stove's temperamental left damper once and for all, which Inez celebrated with a genuine enthusiasm that gratified him. "You're nesting," she told him one evening. "I'm doing maintenance," he said. "Edwin," she said patiently. "The fence posts were necessary," he said. "The fence posts were fine," she said. "The east window needed replacing." "Yes, that one I grant you." She came and put both hands on his arm. "She's going to be safe. The baby is going to be safe. I am going to be safe." "You don't know it's a girl," he said. "I have a feeling," she said. "Women always say that," he said. "And they're right approximately half the time," she said. which is the same as anyone's odds. But I still have the feeling. He put his hand over hers on his arm. I just need everything to be right, he said, and he heard in his own voice something that was very old, from 1876 or before it, the fundamental terror of being the person responsible for something you cannot fully protect. I know, she said. I know you do. She leaned up and kissed him on the jaw. And it will be. But you cannot fix everything against the possibility of loss, Edwin. You know that. He did know that. He'd learned it in the hardest possible way. He also knew that knowing it and feeling it were two different countries. I can try, he said. You can try, she agreed, with a generosity that he didn't entirely deserve. Try all you want. I'll be right here. He held her there in the kitchen while the fire burned and the October wind came down off the mountain, and he thought about what it meant to have something to protect and to be terrified of losing it. He thought about how that terror was the other side of love, inseparable from it, and how for 6 years he'd arranged his entire life to avoid that particular combination. He thought about a fence and a rifle and 3 rules that hadn't even lasted until supper. And he thought about how wrong he'd been. Not that the rules had been wrong at the time. They'd been right for what he'd needed then. But that had been a different man, the one who stood on the porch in the morning and thought that being alone was the same as being safe. This was better. This was terrifying and beautiful and real in a way that the 6 years of solitude had never been, for all their peace. I love you, he said into her hair. I love you too, she said. Now let go, I have beans on the stove. He let go. She went to the stove. He sat down at the table and looked at the ledger, which was in perfect order because she'd been keeping it, and she was much better at it than he was. And the cabin was warm and the mountain was outside doing its autumn work. And everything was, in this exact moment, exactly as it should be. The doctor came from Larimer Creek in December, as arranged. A small, steady man named Dr. Clifton Hayward, who had been practicing frontier medicine for 22 years, and approached everything with a competent matter-of-factness that Edwin found reassuring and Inez found immediately comfortable. He stayed in the spare room that Edwin had built into the east side of the cabin in October, which was the project that had replaced the fence posts and the window as his primary nesting activity, though he maintained he was simply adding necessary space. On a Tuesday in January 1883, the baby was born, and she was a boy. Edwin had been outside because Inez had firmly instructed him to be outside, and Clara Hodges had come up from Larimer Creek as well, because she had experience in this area, and also because she and Inez had become close over the autumn months, an unlikely friendship that had developed through letters and 2 visits, and was characterized by the same direct warmth that Inez brought to everything. Clara and Dr. Hayward managed the proceedings with professional efficiency, and Edwin split an entire winter's worth of wood in the cold morning air, and then some, until Dr. Hayward came out and told him it was over and they were both well. He went in and Inez was in the bed, pale and tired and brighter-eyed than he'd seen her in weeks, and she was holding a small bundle with a gravity and tenderness that arrested him at the bedroom doorway. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked down at the bundle, at the red, emphatically displeased face of his son. "It's a boy," Inez said. "I see that," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "You said girl." "I was wrong," she said simply. "I have a new feeling. His name is Thomas." Edwin looked at her. Then he looked at his son, at the small, resolute face, at the tiny, curled hands. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Calhoun Sheridan," Inez said. "If you want." He sat down on the edge of the bed, and she leaned into him, careful with the baby between them, and he put his arm around her, and she was warm and solid and present, and he looked at the child whose name they had just given to memory and to forward motion at the same time. "Yes," he said. "That's what I want." The years that followed were full and layered in the way that good lives are, with ordinary days that built into something remarkable only when you looked back at them from a distance. Thomas Calhoun Sheridan grew into a child who was clearly his mother's son in several important respects: directness, an early facility with numbers, and an absolute confidence in his relationship with horses that was evident from the first time Inez set him on Cedar's back at the age of 3, holding him securely, while the roan walked placid circles around the corral. Cedar was 13 and in magnificent condition, and received Thomas Sheridan with the same grave dignity she brought to most things she had decided to accept. Edwin watched them, his wife and his son and his horse, and felt something settle in him that had been restless for a very long time. He went to the North Slope every spring, and in the spring of Thomas's 3rd year, Inez came with him and brought the boy, who was told, in clear and age-appropriate terms, that this was a place of remembering, and that the names on the marker were men his father had loved. Thomas looked at the marker with solemn attention, and then asked if Thomas Alcott had also liked horses. "Very much," Edwin said. Thomas nodded, satisfied. He had a wildflower in his fist, one of the small purple alpine ones, and he set it at the base of the marker with the deliberate care of a child who has been told something matters. Edwin had to turn away for a moment. He was not ashamed of it, the catching in his chest, the sting behind his eyes. He had learned slowly and with Inez's patient assistance that this was not weakness, that the capacity to feel the weight of things was not a flaw in the structure but evidence of what had been built there. She found his hand in the way she always did, without looking, without ceremony. He held on to it. In the summer of 1885, their 2nd child was born. This one was a girl, which Inez had predicted with the same confidence she'd predicted a girl the first time, and this time she was correct. They named her Margaret, after Inez's grandmother, and Margaret Sheridan arrived in the world with her father's serious gray eyes and her mother's decided opinions, which she made evident from the earliest possible age. Edwin Sheridan did not rebuild his 3 rules. The fence was still there, but it was a working fence now, a practical boundary for the horses and the garden rather than a metaphysical boundary against the world. He crossed it freely, and people he invited crossed it freely, and Clara Hodges crossed it several times a year for visits that had become a fixed point of their calendar. Dr. Hayward came annually to check the family's health and stay for 3 days and play chess with Edwin in the evenings, which had developed into a standing ritual that both of them pretended was secondary to the medical purpose, and neither believed. The horses were, technically, Edwin's responsibility and always had been, but this was understood by everyone including Edwin to be a formality. Inez and Cedar had a relationship that defied both ownership and explanation, and Thomas had been helping with the corral since he was 4. By the time he was 7, he was doing real work, hauling water and cleaning stalls with a conscientiousness that exceeded his years, and Prospect, who was aging gracefully and with great dignity, had extended his devotion from Inez to include Thomas, which Inez said was the highest honor the horse could bestow. The North Slope was talked about, not always, not casually, but on certain evenings, usually in winter when the fire was high and the children were asleep. Edwin and Inez would sit together, and he would talk about Thomas Alcott and what he'd believed, and the conversations were a kind of tending, the same as you tend a garden, not to bring back what was gone, but to honor what it had grown. He was 36 in the summer of 1887, healthy and weathered, and thoroughly himself in a way he'd never been in the drifting years before the mountain. She was 32, and the practical unsentimentality she'd arrived with had not gone anywhere. It was still the bedrock of how she moved through the world, but it had acquired a warmth over the years, a quality of knowing that things could be both practical and beautiful, both clear-eyed and full. She was in the garden one afternoon in August, which was where she often was in August, the garden at peak productivity, everything needing tending at once. Thomas was helping her, because he was 10 now and genuinely useful rather than industriously in the way. Margaret was nearby, sitting on the garden's edge examining a beetle with the focused scientific interest she brought to most small things, which was something that pleased Edwin in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He came out of the cabin with 2 tin cups of water, because the afternoon was warm and they'd been out there for an hour, and he stood for a moment at the cabin door watching his family in the summer garden, the mountain behind them, the long shadows of the pines moving on the grass. He thought about the day he'd stood on this porch with a rifle and looked at a woman on the wrong side of his fence and understood in that irrational gut-level way that she was going to matter to him. He had been, it turned out, exactly right about that, more right than he'd known how to measure at the time. Inez looked up and saw him standing there, and the look on her face was the one he'd been trying to produce for 5 years, the unguarded one, the wide-open one that appeared when he said something true, and all he'd done was carry water out of a cabin, which was not particularly profound, except that it was exactly what it was supposed to be, ordinary and warm and deliberate. He walked down to the garden and handed her the cup. "Thank you," she said. "The fence is holding," he said. It was an old joke between them now, not said often but understood when it was. "The fence was always open," she said, completing it. He sat down in the grass beside Margaret, who showed him the beetle without looking up, already confident that he would find it as interesting as she did, which he did. Thomas glanced over and made a brief assessment of the beetle, and returned his attention to the beans with a focus that was very much his mother's. The mountain was steady behind them, the peak still carrying a little snow even in August, the way the high country did, and the afternoon light was going golden, and the pines were dark and moving slightly in the wind that came down the slope every evening at this hour. He reached over and took Inez's hand where it rested on her knee. She squeezed his and didn't look up from what she was doing, which was measuring by eye whether the squash needed another day before picking, and she was, as usual, entirely right about it. The squash needed one more day. The fence was open. The rules were long gone. The mountain, which had taken so much from him, had given something back, not in exchange, not as compensation, just the way mountains sometimes do, in their own time and by their own logic, which is the logic of seasons and weather and the slow accumulation of years, and of 2 people who decided, each in their own way, that the risk of letting something matter was smaller than the cost of refusing to. And in the evening of that August day, when the garden had been put to rest and the children were inside and the fire was lit, and the mountain was going dark against the first stars, Edwin Sheridan sat on his porch with his wife and held her hand in the dark between their chairs, the same way he had in the beginning, before anything was named, when all of it was still only a feeling and a fence and 3 rules, and a woman who had already, in her quiet and absolute way, decided to stay. "I've been thinking," Inez said. "About what?" he asked. "About whether we should expand the corral," she said. "Prospect's getting older, and I think he'd benefit from a smaller, quieter space for resting, separate from the main herd." He thought about it. "That would mean extending the east fence line." "Which you've been meaning to do," she said. "For 2 years," he admitted. "Well," she said, "we have time." They did have time. They had the long, high-altitude evenings and the winter fires and the spring thaw and the summer gardens and the falls that came in gold and cold and spectacular. They had Thomas and Margaret, and they had each other, which was its own country with its own geography, one that Edwin had not known he was capable of inhabiting and now could not imagine leaving. The mountain stood above them in the dark, enormous and still, and the stars came out in their extravagant abundance, and the pines moved in the night wind, and below the clearing the horses settled into their nighttime quiet, Cedar and Prospect and the rest of the herd, breathing in the cool September air. The north slope was up there in the dark, the marker standing in the starlight among the small alpine flowers, and what was there was still there, always would be, but it was not a closed wound anymore. It was something tended, something carried without hiding. And here was the porch and the light from inside the cabin, and Inez Thatcher Sheridan sitting with her shoulder against his, warm and real and exactly herself. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The mountain was quiet. Everything was as it should be.